Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. And as you heard, I'm Jeremy, this is Victoria, and we're talking about an introduction to Jewish genealogy, exploring your family history. And we go on, and we're talking about genealogy in the 21st century. This is my part of the talk. It's a bit like a click and clack brothers show. We have three halves. I do my half, Victoria does her half, and then we open up to Q&A at the end. So I'm going to talk about a philosophical approach, because genealogy in the 21st century is radically different from the way it used to be pre-internet. And the first question I ask everyone is, how do you think? Because thinking today is very much more different than when it was before the internet. There was very little information available, and there was very few accesses. So how do we think? Thank you again. We need to be much more efficient today in how we do our research, how we look after our documents, how we retrieve them. And I'm always telling everyone that paper is now passé. You have to think about the computer, digitizing, scanning, and saving, and creating our library, our bookshelves, our file cabinet within the computer. We end up otherwise with so many boxes, so many binders full of stuff that after a few years we're scratching our heads wondering where that valuable piece of paper is. So context is a very important thing as well. Genealogy is far more than just names and dates and places. When you get into it, you start asking other questions about, well, what was that country called that they lived in? I know the borders kept changing. What was the geography like? Things like that. And finally, I talk about collaboration, which after I've done all the other aspects, I come back to collaboration and tell you that collaboration is the very first thing that we need to do before we do anything else. Before the internet, I'm not sure how many of you were researching your family before the days of the internet and the World Wide Web, but we remember about how few records were available. We mostly used books, and normally they're kept like this. Where was the stuff that we're looking for? Or we had reels and reels of microfilm with the Mormons, and so we'd spend hours and hours going through the microfilm reader, going blind, trying to find the frame. And of course, back then, we were looked down upon. Historians were the big thing. Genealogists, what's that? And there were very limited places. We were not really accepted in archives and libraries as we are today. Places were harder to get to. It wasn't today where everyone has their catalog online, and we don't have to even get dressed and slip around our pajamas and sit down at a computer. We didn't have to email. Who remembers before email? We had to write letters. So we had to figure out where the address was, who was the right person, or if you had to get an envelope, paper, stamps. We don't do that anymore. Or we had to call if we could find out between 9 and 5 of the phone number. So things have changed an awful lot from the old days before the internet to today, where we are overwhelmed with information, with resources, with documents. And so that's why it's very important that we are far more efficient, because the one thing we don't have more of is time. And so we have to be a lot more efficient in how we do our research, how we record, capture, and keep our information so we can access it quickly and share it with other people. As I've said, a lot more is available online. Many, many archives libraries have at least put all their catalogs online. As I don't need to tell you, a lot more information is online. Again, it's overwhelming the number of databases, becoming aware who has got what kind of information. Some of it is free, which Victoria will talk about. Some of it is fee for service, where you have to pay so much money, either to join for a year or a certain period of time. And I'm sure, how many people put their hands up in Ancestry? Yeah, a lot of you. Well, 12 years ago, there were no images. It was just lists of indexes or indices of names. Today, we take it for granted. We almost, the audacity of expectation if we click on their name, we're going to see the original document. Well, 12 years ago, that never happened even with our ancestry. So a lot has changed in the last 3 years. And I'm sure the numbers changed since I last prepared this. But they have 11 billion records online, and that's just ancestry. There's many other websites which Victoria and I will talk about. And so again, I keep coming back to the point of the fact that it's so easy to be overwhelmed with this kind of activity that it really behooves us from day one to think about how we think about doing this, how we're going to go about doing it, how we're going to capture, how we're going to store the information so it becomes useful not to us but to our own descendants. And as I've said, we need to think digitally. Whenever you get documentation, documents, scan them, label them, put them in a folder. So you have one with city directories, one with censuses, one with birth, marriage, and death certificates, and follow them by family name. I'm not going to tell you how to do that. There are plenty of books, there's plenty of things online that will teach you, but also decide on a system that works for you, because you're the one that's going to be using the computer. And that way, once things are digital, you can put them on CDs, you can put them on DVDs. It's so much more easy to share things with people. Walking around with an original document, if you keep touching it, it's going to fall apart. It's much, much safer to put it into archival, acceptable document sleeves and binders, which I can talk to you about afterwards. And copy the document, put it in the computer. And if you want translation of something that's in a foreign language, again, we'll talk about that in the second half, but it's much more easy to make it transportable to the digital. When I go to a library or an archive, I mean, today it made it even more simple with your cell phone and taking a camera. Always take a camera with you. If for some reason they won't allow you to scan it or photocopy it because it's too old, for example, the Sutra Library in San Francisco won't allow you to copy anything that's older than 1925. But if you have a camera, take a picture. You can always put that image on your computer. You can then share it with everyone. Or if you can photocopy, again, scan, put it in your computer. Less time spent in archives and libraries retrieving the information. I mean, I've been into libraries and seen people sitting there with a book and a pencil and a paper and copying everything out word for word. I mean, you get distracted, you might transcribe incorrectly, you might miss a line, you might have to go to the bathroom, come back and miss something or a page. It's so much more effective to take a photograph in 5 seconds of that page, that document, where you won't have any issues about transcription or something you did wrong and you missed something. And again, sharing documents is so much easier. Particularly, we want to share things with our people down the road, with our younger generation of family members. They're all thinking digitally, they're all thinking computers, if not iPhones, iPads, that kind of thing. We have to move into the arena where we want to connect with people the way they communicate. And doing it digitally is the best way to do it. Why context? Why context? We start out, well, what was his name? When was he born? When did he get married? When did they die? And where? Names, dates, and places are just a skeleton of what we're doing in trying to resurrect, to recreate the life of people in our family. We need to understand so much more. We need to understand the history of where they were living, what was going on around them during the time that they were living in Poland or Ukraine or Galicia or wherever it might be. We need to understand the geography. Were they living in a big city? Were they living in a shepherd? What kind of transportation was nearby? Were they near a river? Were they near trains? Were they near a road? You have to understand, put yourself into their shoes and think how they would have been thinking during those late 1700s, early 1800s. You have to understand the politics, what made people move from one place to another. My father's mother's family were Königsberg. I think they lived in a shtetl in the 1700s outside the city of Königsberg in Prussia. Why did they move to Vilkaviskas, Lithuania in the turn of the century, 1800s, where my great-great-grandfather was born there in 1828? I have to understand the politics of what made people move. Also to understand the socioeconomics. Was life bad there? Was there famine? Was there economic depression? It wasn't all pogroms. There are other reasons, or maybe they knew someone who was doing better somewhere else, and they wrote a letter and said, come and live here, there's much better living to be made. There were also periodic epidemic outbreaks, and you can find a whole list of all these on Wikipedia. Pandemic outbreaks, why the Irish left because of famine, why people left because of TB outbreaks, or why they died in certain places and you don't know whatever happened to them. These are all pointers as to fleshing out the lives of the people, our ancestors, and giving you a better chance of understanding why collaboration. It's the 21st century. If you're just starting out, wonderful, because you won't make the mistakes that we had to make 20 or 30 years ago. People have already made those mistakes, learn the answers, and they can share them with you. There's lots of trees out there on other websites. My Genie, Heritage, Ancestry, Victoria and I will talk about that later on. There may be people who share trees, who share parts of trees with your family. You can piggyback off what they have done, but also check their documentation and source and citations. Connect with the people who make those trees, and you may discover new cousins you never knew you had. So I will end this portion of my first half by saying, don't reinvent the wheel, or don't replant the family tree, because someone may have done it already. So all that philosophical approach about context and collaboration and how to be more efficient in your research, we're now going to turn to the second part of our presentation, which is exploring genealogy, self-overview, and I will hand over to my wonderful partner, Victoria.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you all hear me all right? Okay, great. My name is Victoria Fish. I was introduced. My mother was born in San Francisco and spent her high school years in New York, and I was born in New York. I've been in California since I was 19. I won't tell you how old I am. So part two of our presentation is about the practical steps you can take to trace your family. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Jewish immigration to the Western Hemisphere, and then I will present an overview of basic genealogical research methodology. Included in our PowerPoints down the road, you will see documents we have retrieved, birth records, marriage records, death records. And what we've chosen to do is to highlight one particular family who lived in Lake County, not too far down the road, Napa area, and also San Francisco. And there's a reason we're using him as an example that will be revealed at the end of our talk. Okay, here's my go back. Thank you. Okay, I don't know how many of you know much about the history of immigration to the Western Hemisphere, but it really started. It was based upon the expulsion from Spain in 1492. The Jews went to Portugal, to the Netherlands. They became involved in commerce there, and from there they moved to the West Indies, New Spain, which is what we could call Mexico now, and South America. And in 1553, the first boatload of Jews came to New York. I believe there were 23 on the boat. They were coming from Brazil, and they were escaping the Inquisition in Brazil. They landed in Manhattan, and Peter Stuyvesant, who was the governor at the time, was not especially happy to see them, and he told them to leave. However, what he hadn't counted on was that the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, had Jews on its board of directors who had emigrated to the Netherlands. And they put pressure on him, and those Jews were allowed to stay. They continued to relocate to the Caribbean area, to the eastern seaboard and southern states. Those are some of the earliest Jewish settlements in the United States. And also they continued to emigrate to the southern hemisphere. The Inquisition also continued. There are some places in Mexico that are known to have enclaves of conversos, Jews had been forced to convert to Catholicism, and some of those wound up emigrating into the lower part of Texas and New Mexico, and there are still remnants of those families there. Okay, next. So that was Sephardic immigration. That was the predominant immigration that occurred first. What I call the first wave of Ashkenazi immigration happened from the 1600s to the 1850s, and again, it was predominantly along the eastern seaboard, and it was made up of what we like to call German Jews, but really they were the Jews who were from the unaligned German states along the Rhine River Valley, which also included parts of France that was contested territory that went back and forth between Germany and France. The second wave occurred beginning with the gold rush. It's interesting to note that during that same year, and I see I haven't corrected it, the California gold rush was 1848, it was the peak of revolutions in Europe. All over Europe, monarchies were being deposed, new parliaments were being set up, and actually Jews were initially being afforded new freedoms. They were included in some of the parliaments. There was a backlash. People's livelihoods were threatened, and they were threatened because there was so much turmoil fomenting. Many of those people chose to come to California when they heard about the gold rush. They were excited about the possibilities of enlarging their life. In Eastern Europe, Jews were traditionally prohibited from owning land, which is one of the reasons they turned to becoming merchants and became very skilled in those professions. They made an easy transition when they came to California, when they came to the United States at that time, to becoming merchants here. There were a number of gold rushes. The Fraser River Gold Rush was up in British Columbia. Many California gold rush arrivals wound up going up there too. The Franco-Prussian War caused another small wave of immigrants, especially from that contested area of France. And then the Klondike Gold Rush at the turn of the century also attracted many Jewish merchants. And as you probably know, most of the Jews who came did not come to mine. As we say, they came to mine the miners' pockets. We go back one more bit. There is also a very little documented immigration to Central and South America during an early period, before the third wave or the largest wave of Jewish immigration. Central America had quite a few Jews who emigrated from what was Prussia at that time. We're going to talk about boundaries in a minute, who wound up going into actually becoming coffee plantation owners. Okay, next slide, please. The third wave is the wave that many of you who are Jewish may be descended from immigrants who came during that era. And that was the largest period of Jewish immigration to the United States. It lasted from the 1880s to the 1900s. There were several factors that influenced it. You may have heard within your own family about conscription. Jewish boys were conscripted for the Russian army at the age of as young as 9 years old, and they were forced to serve for 25 years. Some Jewish young men chose to name themselves physically so they would be ineligible to serve, and others made their way to the United States. Next slide, please. The fourth wave, which was a little smaller, happened at the inception of World War I and the period just before it. During the First World War, there was a period of time, I think from about 1917 to 1920, when actually the shipping lines were restricted and there was very little or no immigration. But that wave also made their way in through Canada and sometimes into the United States, and some people stayed in Canada, and again, Central and South America, which became a much larger wave of immigration at the inception of World War II, and that's where you find many Jews who were turned away from other countries coming into South America and Central America, and sometimes from Central America into the United States. Next slide, please. Okay, I was talking to someone at lunch about this. Jeremy and I kind of joke about this all the time, but we had a similar situation, which is people will come to us and they'll say, my grandfather was from Polish Russia or Poland, Russia. Where was he from? Well, it depends on when he was born. Next slide. The country that we think of as Poland ceased to exist in 1795. 3 empires divided it up: Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia. And they began the first of 3 partitions in 1772. By 1795, Poland was no more. It was the province of Posen. Let's see, where is it? It's, oh gosh. It is, here, actually go to the next slide. I think that shows it a little better. It is Prussia. I think 9 is Posen. Well,
11.
11, thank you. Okay, so this is, this is what was Poland, and it became Posen. And during what I call the second wave of immigration, and sometimes into the third, people who were from this region, when asked by census takers where they were from, depending on the year they were asked, would answer in different ways. Sometimes they would say Poland, even though Poland was no more. Sometimes they would say Prussia, which was probably more accurate, and quite often they said Germany. Do not be fooled when you are going through census, depending on what years your family came over to the United States. Take their nativity as identified in the census. Take it lightly. It may not be accurate. Some of this was motivated because the Jews who'd come earlier from the German states tended to look down on their Eastern European brethren. It wasn't cool to be Polish. In fact, they went so far as to develop something that was called the Galveston Plan. How many of you have heard of that? What they did was, these German Jews decided that they really didn't want the Eastern European Jews coming into the large populated cities that were already filled with Jews, and they decided to ship them somewhere else. They shipped them to Texas, they shipped them to Nebraska, the Dakotas. So people were not always truthful on census, and this is something you need to recognize and hold in reserve. When I'm doing genealogical research, I usually put all the countries I see that they say, and I note them all. And eventually I ferret out which is the correct one. Next slide, please. Here's another map. This is just before, this is actually to the end of World War I, it looks like. But what you also see here are, it begins in 1871, which would have been the end of the Franco-Prussian War. So all of these were the unaligned German states that then became unified as Germany. Okay, let's talk more specifically on how to find your family history. You all have handouts which have a very good outline of this. You can choose to follow along or just refresh your memory when you get home. Next slide, please. Okay. I have divided methodology for research into 4 main segments: assembling information, constructing a family tree, extracting data from documents that you find, and discovering primary sources. Next slide. Okay. This is reproduced in your handout. This is a list of basic primary sources that you can use to gather information about your family that will help you understand a larger picture of their life. Next. Jeremy and I believe that to accurately find your family, it's important to proceed in a careful manner. Jewish families, many of them have similar or the same surnames, and there are many of the same or similar first names. It's imperative that you identify your particular clan, and to do this, you need to proceed in an orderly manner. So what we suggest you do is you set up a chart. And the first thing you would start with is, you would start with yourself preferably, and I'll show that in the next slide, but these are the items that you're going to include in your family chart. You're going to have the first name of your family member, and we're going to talk a little bit more about names in a few minutes. You're going to include the different spellings of the last name that you are aware of, and you are going to have as much data as you have available. You may have approximations of date, you may have approximations of place, you may know where somebody lived but not where they were born and died, and I suggest you put all of that information into your initial rough chart of your family tree. Okay, so this family tree is going to be about Saul Levinson, this fellow who I told you about, who lived not far away. He was born in 1867 in Lake County, and he's going to be you. These are his parents. To the left, oops, come back one. Thank you. To the left, we have his father, where he lived and died. And to the right, we have his mother with her maiden name. Here's Saul Levinson down below. Next slide. Once you have those three components, you start filling in, working backwards in time. So you have both paternal grandparents and both maternal grandparents. Next. After that, we suggest that you start filling in each side of the tree with siblings. Why do we do this? Because Jeremy and I have found that if you cannot find data following the direct line of your family through yourself, your father, your grandfather, and back, it's really wise and it may be helpful to expand your search horizontally. That way, you will have a far larger pool of data to deal with, especially when it comes to discovering the nativity of your family, immigration records, and it will give you multiple sources to narrow down your choices and to really determine where your family came from. Okay. So I have on you have a chart in your handout that shows this. You want to add your parents' siblings, their spouses and children. You want to go back a generation, add your grandparents' siblings, their spouses, their children. So you're enlarging your chart tremendously. Okay. Let's talk about names. Your Jewish ancestor probably had more than one name. A child was given a Hebrew name at birth, and this name was used during religious observance. A Yiddish diminutive was also often used at home, and another name was used outside the home which corresponded to the language of the country in which the family was living. So, Moses, who may be called up to the bima to read from the Torah in shul, might be Moshe or Moshela at home, and Morris at his place of work. Note all those names down, especially if you happen to be using Ancestry and you'd like the Ancestry search engine to work hard for you. Every name should be on that first name line. And so the same with the surname. Put every permutation on that second line.
And also, if you don't know a date for someone, make up one that you think is approximately. You'll find a better chance of getting Ancestry to work for you and bring back information.
Yes, Ancestry will not really do a search unless you have a date, so make one up. By the way, Jeremy and I team teach this class, and he is not interrupting me. We interject information in each other's conversation all the time, so just be aware of that. Okay, let's talk about naming patterns. In Jewish genealogical research, it's really important to pay attention to traditional naming patterns. Ashkenazi tradition dictates that children are never named after a living person and are often named for deceased grandparents. This may give you a really big clue as to the date a grandparent died when you see that children in a grandchildren's generation are all named with the same name and they were all born around the same time. And if you don't know the grandparents' names, this is going to clue you in as to what the name may have been as well. Now, Sephardic tradition is very different. The first son is named after the paternal grandfather, even if he is alive. the second son after the maternal grandfather, the first daughter after the paternal grandmother, and the second daughter after the maternal grandmother. So there's a pattern that can help you as well. Families who came to the United States and who lived here for subsequent generations very often discarded this tradition. But for earlier generations of your family, this may be a useful tool. We're going to talk about dates of birth now. I always assume that the earliest date of birth that I find in the record is probably the closest to the most accurate. Bear in mind that if an ancestor was born in the Old Country, their date of birth was based on the Hebrew calendar, which is a lunar calendar with 13 months. When individuals came to America, they often made guesses as to the corresponding day and month in the Gregorian calendar used in the United States. So frequently, the date and month were flexible. Very often you would have someone who came over and said, I know I was born around Passover. I know I was born around Yom Kippur. But you may see that their dates of birth that they give for a World War I registration, a World War II, are not the same. Dates were definitely flexible. And sometimes people also made themselves younger. And I'm going to talk about that. In my own family, and in many of the families I've been researching, I kept seeing people being born on the 15th. In my own family, my mother's siblings, they were all born on the 15th. I go, what is this? So some of these dates are made up. Just know that. So what you want to do is you want to pick the date that is going to give you the most flexibility in terms of, for instance, ancestry, pulling up records, which may be really important if someone has a Social Security number and will be in the SSDI, the Social Security Death Index. But for your own information, always make a notation as to what the earliest date of birth is that you have found, because again, it is probably closest to the truth. Now, I have a rule of thumb for women's ages. They are usually a minimum of 2 years older than they say they are. Usually more. In fact, what we have found is when the women are really young, they make sure they're young, and as they get a little older, they make sure they stay young. And when they get to be really old, they don't care anymore. And sometimes you get a more truthful age, or sometimes they continue lying. I have come across women, usually unmarried women, because there was a real stigma about being spinsters, who stretched the truth so much that they reported they were from 10 to 15 years younger than they really were. So don't be surprised. Now, men's vanity, I'm not leaving you guys out, contributed to incorrect birth years less often than women. However, when men remarried to younger spouses, they sometimes suddenly became younger as well. So, as I say, take with a grain of salt the date of birth. Remember to be flexible about it. I would say for men, if you are searching in a period where you come across a World War I registration for the United States, those dates of birth may be accurate, and if they are not, they may be the date that the person tended to use for the rest of his life. So it's a good date to hang on to. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Okay, birth certificates. Oh, did we miss a slide? Maybe not. No, I think we're missing something. Go back. Can you go back one? Okay, so let's go to the next one. Okay, so what's going on here? All right. Go ahead, next. Okay, extracting data. So I have a list that I gave you of pertinent documentation. Once you have your family chart constructed, and you want to start examining all the data, if you haven't already examined all the data, and start transcribing the information into your chart. Personally, I prefer when I'm starting this kind of a research, especially I advise people who are not experienced researchers, I think it's a really good idea to do this by hand. Computer-generated family charts are great, but it doesn't allow you to have a bird's eye view of your family with one sweep. Plus, if you're doing it manually, there's a lot more data you can add that you may need to keep referring to as you construct a chart online. So, family sitters or Bibles may contain birth and death dates. Letters, postcards, and holiday cards may contain important addresses and dates, if you look at the postage mark. And photographs are always important as well. Some obviously will be identified and some may not. If you run across photographs that are not identified and there is an older member of your family still living, take advantage of that and see if they can identify the people in the photos and have some idea of when the period the photograph was taken may have been.
And there are people out there who are expert in dress, clothing, and you can go to them and they can probably suggest a period of time to within 10 years of when a photograph might have been taken by looking at someone's clothing.
Okay, so let's go to the next. We're going to talk about the primary documents that we mentioned in the list. Birth certificates. Obviously, this is going to depend upon whether the person was born in the United States or whether documentation overseas is available and accessible to that person. However, date of birth, parents' name, sometimes you will encounter the mother's maiden name. Sometimes you will encounter the age of the parents at the time of the child's birth. Sometimes she may indicate how many children she's had previously. Birth certificates can be obtained from county recorders, health departments, or departments of vital records within counties. Sometimes you may be requested for birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage certificates to submit some kind of a photo ID. Every state and every county has different regulations concerning obtaining this documentation. And my best advice would be go on the web, look for that particular county, and you're going to see what kind of documentation you need to provide and what they will permit you to access. Next. This is an 1874 birth register for the brother of Saul Levinson, the fellow we're talking about. And if you'll notice, on the top we have the name of the father and the maiden name of the mother. Next. Yeah, thank you. This is a little bit later, 20 years later. This is from Chico. In this one we have the father's last name. It was a boy who was born. This was the full name of the father, the maiden name of the mother, where they were both born, the occupation of the father, and where they are living. Marriage records. Again, they may or may not contain a tremendous amount of data depending on where you're obtaining them from. New York marriage certificates from the 1890s, turn of the century, till about 1910 or so, are really wonderful. They have the age of the bride and groom, the names of their parents, including the maiden name of the mother. They may have witnesses that may or may not be related to the family. If they're relatives, it may be clear. If the names are completely unrecognizable, they may have been people who were sitting in the shul when the couple happened to get married. And you'll have the address also of the bride and groom, and they're a wonderful resource. We have found in our experience, people ask us this all the time, can I get the marriage certificate from a synagogue? And we usually say no, it's very unusual. If you're lucky, you might have a family ketubah or a Hebrew marriage contract, but it's much less likely that a synagogue will have retained marriage records. Is that right?
Yes, most of the time you're going to find a civilian record, a civil record.
Okay.
So you'll go to the local authority to get a copy, an uncertified copy.
Okay, next. Yeah. Okay, here's the marriage index from 1859. This is a very unusual marriage certificate index. You're going to see why in a moment. Actually, Jeremy, would you like to talk about this?
Okay, just put me on the spot again. Abraham Levinson married Yetta Bukowski on the 10th of October, 1859. And if you see the middle box at the top, it says recorded date at the request of Edward Bukowski, who was Yetta's brother. And the remarks at the bottom right says marriage contract instead of certificate.
It says let me read it.
And recorded in the recorder's book.
Yeah.
Now the reason this is very interesting, and I've never seen this before, is because when I went all the way up from Berkeley, where I was living, to the county office to get the record, this is what I actually got. They had actually put into the recorder's book the ketubah, the marriage of ketubah between Abraham Levinson and Yetta Bukowski. Not this is necessarily going to tell me anything new, but it's highly unusual, and I've never heard of anyone else. I've been doing it for 30 years. I've never heard of a ketubah being officially entered into a county record. So it was very nice, because they're not very common in the older times to see these things. So to have this on file, it was good.
A ketubah is a traditional Jewish marriage contract, and what's interesting about it is it actually provides that if the couple gets a divorce, if the individual members obtain a get or a religious divorce, that the husband is required to provide for his wife after that time. It's almost like a prenup.
And there's a monetary value attached.
Yeah, yeah. So some families have retained Hebrew ketubahs of their family
This is
members.
in English, which is nice. Usually they're in Hebrew. Today there's a big market for people who get married. Very fanciful designs, circular, fancy backgrounds. So it's not something that's unusual or unknown today. So moving on.
Okay, now this is a marriage certificate from New York, 1923. What's nice about it is not only do we have the name of the groom, which I can't even read. Oh, Hyman, okay, it's up here. And the name of his bride. But we have where in Russia he came from, Mogilev, Russia. We have his father's name, Mendel, and his mother's first name and maiden name. And I don't think my... can you hear me? Yeah, I'm a little out of sync here. Okay, and the same thing for the wife. And so this is the value of obtaining this kind of documentation. It enables you to go back another generation. It enables you to possibly find siblings based on finding the nuclear clan of your family. Okay, death certificates. Death certificates are probably the least reliable primary source documentation you could find. And why? Because the deceased is not giving the information. The respondent is quite frequently a child who may or may not know his parents' names, because usually you're asked to give the name of the deceased father, the name of the deceased mother, and the child may not know that. Or the child may know it and know it phonetically from what was told. So you may find a death certificate that has the mother's maiden name and you've never seen it spelled like this, and you say, oh my gosh, this is a new spelling, or this can't be the same family. It may just be based on oral transmission of the child hearing the name of the family. Same thing with actually nativity too. Sometimes people will transmit orally the name of the town. It's not lining up with anything you found, and so you need to put on your thinking cap and figure out what it could possibly be. We can talk about that also.
So always be careful when you get a death certificate, which you should do, but be very careful about what information it contains.
Right, and so if you have no other source, it's important, of course, to see if you can locate the death certificate, because you may be able to find the names of the parents. It'll also list the time the person lived in the United States, which may or may not be true. And, more importantly, the cemetery or mortuary. Now, mortuary records sometimes include pertinent information, and certainly cemeteries, knowing the cemetery that your ancestor was buried in, can provide more clues because headstones speak to us. Okay, same sources for death certificates, and what's our next slide? Okay, this is the death certificate for our main character of the story, Saul Levinson. He died in San Francisco, and I see that this projector is not allowing me to see when. Do you remember when he died? 25?
25.
25, okay. Okay, in San Francisco, and Jeremy did obtain a death certificate. It does list his mother's and maiden name, and okay, Abraham Levinson and Henrietta Bukowski are listed there.
And also where he was buried, which is very useful to know.
Yes. Okay, this is a funeral record for Saul Levinson, and here we're going to talk a little bit about death notices. There is a difference between a death notice and an obituary. An obituary is a news article that a newspaper chooses to run because someone achieved some perhaps small measure of renown. A death notice, on the other hand, is what's placed by a family in the deaths section of a newspaper. Now, the reason this is really important to genealogists is it will usually list a surviving spouse and surviving children, and it may indicate a spouse or children who have predeceased the person who has just died. It will also often indicate where the person is going to be buried if you haven't been able to figure that out in any other way. Sometimes funeral records, depending on where they're from and when they were from, will also list the person's parents' names, but again, this information has been given by a respondent, so it may or may not be true. Okay, I mentioned that cemeteries can speak to us. The most critical piece of information that a headstone can give us is the name of the deceased's father. If a headstone is inscribed in Hebrew in the United States, it may or may not contain the name of the father, depending on the family, how assimilated they were, what year it took place. This particular headstone is, I believe, for Saul Levinson's brother. No, this is for his father. This is for Abraham. And he died in 1873. He died very early.
In Upper Lake County.
And this one does not have his father's name on it, I don't believe.
No.
It doesn't. Okay. In your handout, I've listed a couple of other sources for cemetery and mortuary records. Headstones, okay, Find a Grave. Are people familiar with Find a Grave? It's an online website. People contribute to it on a volunteer basis. Jewish Gen, and I have the URLs in your handout, has an enormous database called the Jewish Online Worldwide Burial Records Register, okay, which is also being compiled on a volunteer basis. People go to cemeteries, they transcribe information of headstones, sometimes from cemetery books, registers, and they get loaded onto a database. It's an invaluable source of information. Jewish Gen is an organization with a website that you can access for free. You do have to register. You're given a password and a number. But sometimes when you can't find burial information anywhere else, someone will have recorded your ancestors' burial. Can you just hold it till we're done? Because I want to go through this a little bit. Yes?
It's specifically to this. Is that JOWER?
Yeah.
Is that only Jewish
Yes.
records?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's Jewish Gen.
Yes,
The website is Jewish Gen, and they are hosting a database called the Jewish Gen Online Worldwide Burial Register.
Yeah.
My society in San Francisco has been working to document the Bay Area cemeteries, and we have to date entered 35,000 names from 3 cemeteries in Colma and a few other surrounding cemeteries into the database. That's
And yet that is not complete. There are cemeteries his society has not yet transcribed. And it's worldwide. So there are cemeteries overseas that have been partially transcribed as well. We'll take some questions. Yes?
That's the Masonic symbol at
Yes.
the very top.
Yes.
Is that another source of information?
No, unfortunately. When the Jews came out to the gold rush, to California, and settled in California early, there was very little stigma about being Jewish. Everybody was an immigrant. And as a result, lots of lodges accepted Jews freely, and Jews took advantage of the fact and became members of all kinds of lodges.
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So really the only information that you can glean from that is that yes, he was a member of the Masons of one particular lodge, probably in the area that he lived in. Many Jews achieved very high ranks. He may have been mentioned in one of the books that are compiled at their annual conventions, which lists members of Masonic lodges. But beyond that, there's not a lot of information it will give you.
You can find things out. I mean, you'll find in death notices, in newspaper accounts, you'll find the city directory sometimes where they list them, people who were members of lodges, and many of them. And there are some Jewish ones as well. But I don't believe you're going to find much more if you go to a Masonic lodge themselves and ask for information.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of documentation available either. Was there another question? I thought I saw another hand up. Yes?
Yeah, in the early 40s, the Laurel Hill Cemetery in San Francisco dug everybody out and moved them to Colma.
Actually, it was before that. When was Laurel Hill?
Well, that event.
It carried on. It was a big fight. There's an article I've got at
No, my
home.
question
It went
20s
was,
on
and
for a
30s.
long
how
time.
accurately did they track the records during the move?
They didn't. That's the answer.
This is a whole amazing.
Yeah, talk to us
story.
afterwards. For those of you who don't know, there was a very early Jewish cemetery actually up in Laurel Hill, and then there were two main Jewish cemeteries in what is now Dolores Park, each one owned by a different synagogue. Is that right?
Emmanuel and Sheriff Israel.
In 1889, the city decided that everybody was moving their buried dead out of town to Colma, and at that point, disinterments began, and they were reburied in several cemeteries in Colma. However, sometimes they took the stones, and sometimes they didn't. His society, the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish Genealogical Society, is in the process of trying to track who got moved and who didn't get moved.
We're working with UC Berkeley Bancroft Library, who have the records of Sheriff Israel, for example, and the burial records from the original cemetery, and we want to match those up with the people who are now buried in the Sheriff Israel Hills of Eternity down in Colma, and see if there is anyone missing. Not that that would give us, I mean, we just know who's missing, we won't know where they are, of course. When people were exhumed and moved by the church or synagogue, that was done free to the family, but the family themselves had to then pay for either the removal of the original headstone down to the new cemetery, or if they had the funds to buy a new headstone, or as we've seen in Colma, they don't have a headstone at all. So all we have to go by is what might be in the books of the cemetery office relating to that person. You won't find the father's name in Hebrew if it was on the original headstone. I've actually just recently seen a removal within a cemetery from one section to another. They didn't make room for the wife, and when she died 20 years later, they moved the husband, and they just put a blank stone up with the word black and 3 little stones and no other information. So I lost what might have been there originally 20 years earlier.
And the other thing is that when you are looking on the JOWBR, J-O-W-B-R, you will notice some of the listings will say reinterment. And so the date that is given as the date of death may just be the date of reinterment, so keep that in mind as well.
Okay, moving on.
Yes. Okay, this next headstone is Saul Levinson's brother Edward.
No symbolism.
This is, there's no definitive answer for the shaking hands. We've been investigating recently cemetery symbology, and some people say that it may be saying goodbye to friends.
Family, whatever.
Yeah, yeah. But this headstone is completely in English except for the bottom line, which says,
Is that in Hebrew?
I think it's the here. May
May
his soul be
no,
bound
no,
up.
you haven't.
Yeah. Okay.
Soul, depending on what it's made of female.
Okay. Okay, and this is Saul's headstone, which is not in Hebrew at all.
And he says very little, but moving on.
Okay. Actually, I want to digress for a minute and talk about Landsmannschaften.
Okay.
Okay. Are any of you familiar, and many of you may be familiar, with Landsmannschaften groups? Okay. These groups were more prevalent on the East Coast, dating from the end of the last century into the present. There are Landsmannschaften now. And basically what they were groups formed by people who came from the same town or region in Europe, or they could have been social or political societies like the Workmen's Circle. Now, the value of knowing about this has to do with if your family was from back east. We haven't really seen this out west. It's more prevalent in New York and New Jersey.
They're predominantly in New York.
Right. What a Landsmannschaften did was, they started out as benevolent societies. So the function of a benevolent society was to aid the indigent, help brides who didn't have dowries. If a family was ill, they helped, and they helped to bury the dead. And they became actually burial societies. Now, there's a Hebrew word, Shever Kadisha, which specifically is a burial society. This kind of a burial society is the group of men and women who prepared the deceased body for burial. However, the English term burial society has come to also signify Landsmannschaften. My grandfather belonged to one. Many of your ancestors may have as well. And what they did was they asked for a weekly fee, maybe 25 cents, 50 cents, and it was put into a pot, and when you died, your burial was paid for. Now, the benefit of knowing this is twofold. One is that if you go to a cemetery, sometimes Landsmannschaften erected archways over their particular plot. They would own a particular part of a cemetery. And if you go to find a relative and you look around, you may find relatives that you didn't know you had. Another way of doing this is by accessing, there are about 7 New York online databases for some of the older Jewish cemeteries. And they list the Landsmannschaften, which they call the society. And sometimes you will see, if you just do a search by society, and maybe even your surname, you'll see a whole bunch of people, and they may all have been relatives of your families. Okay, next. Okay, we're going to talk about Chip's Passage or Manifests. How many of you are familiar with these? How many of you access them? Great. Okay, so this is the data that we can obtain sometimes, especially after 1906, when many of these manifests were in 2 pages. You may be able to obtain the country or the town of birth. They may have been very specifically. The last column usually asks for where you were born. The other thing they ask for is the name and the address of who you were going to see in the United States. This was very frequently some kind of a relative. It's often indicated. It may be son-in-law, it may be son, it may be daughter. And this is another person for you to follow up on, especially if you've never heard of them before. So always make sure you look completely across the line, and if it's after 1906, or if you go to the top of the manifest and you see it says da-da-da United, and you can see it's been broken, it needs a second page that's going to say states, it's a 2-page manifest. And push the button to see the next page, and on that page you may find also data about the name of the person they left in the old country. You may be able to obtain the name of a mother or father who was left behind. Yes?
I found it an interesting point. If you compare those ship manifest records with the name on the registry at Ellis Island,
Yes.
that's what the transition point is for screwed up names.
Okay, actually, let's talk about this.
Maybe
Okay.
that's not an accurate term.
No, we're going to talk about this for a second. Okay, this is the most common, okay, first I'm going to not deal with what you're saying, I'm going to digress a tiny bit. The most common myth, and I know you're all going to get mad at me for this, is that my grandfather was at Ellis Island and the clerk changed his name. It's not true, and I will tell you why. Because when your ancestor was in Bremen or Hamburg, there was a manifest filled out with his name written in it. And that particular manifest made its way all the way to the United States. His name was always written down. The bursar at Ellis Island had the manifest in front of him. He knew the name of your ancestor. Now, this is not to say that a few days or weeks, or even perhaps the same day when your ancestor arrived at Ellis Island, they decided, I don't want to be looking like a greener, which is what they called them. I want a more American name. I'm going to change my name. And usually they didn't do this legally, they just did it. So now you're telling me that from Hamburg to the manifest at Ellis Island, it looked a little different. Okay, this is one of the reasons. The Hamburg passenger manifest was filled out with somebody who was fluent in probably multiple languages, was much more used to hearing other languages and knowing how they were spelled. The manifest which we see sometimes that the bursar has may not have been quite right, and then there's another complication when you're searching for a passage manifest, the indexers, especially if you're looking for an Eastern European name. Many of the people who have indexed for Ellis Island, who have indexed for Ancestry, are not familiar with these names, and they have mistranscribed them. So that may contribute to your difficulty to finding your ancestor on a ship. How many of you are familiar with Steve Morris's website? Okay, so if for those of you who don't know, I'm sure on the handout I have his website listed. There is an entry course portal to Ellis Island through Steve Morse's website. It's much more accurate, and I suggest that you use it.
Just to go back,
We lost our umlaut at Ellis Island. We used to be first, and now it's lost.
It wasn't at Ellis Island, it was your family who did it.
when people emigrate, when people,
My comment, it's actually spelling change, not a name change.
But
So that explains it.
but it's what your family chose to do. If you look through the census, people spelled that were not as rigid about how their name was spelled. Many people's names are spelled in Cyrillic. And so the transition to English was...
we have seen in city directories in this country the same person listed on the same page twice with different spelling of the same name. When people emigrated, they had documentation. You couldn't just leave Russia or Poland or Germany. You had to have a passport or a visa. So when you arrived at Ellis Island, and they actually split the manifest up, the first and second and third class passengers went to the piers, and the steerage class went to Ellis Island. They actually had paper documentation. So they knew who they were because they had the pieces of paper. And the immigration official would check on the manifest and just check off the name once he sees that person with the same matching name. It was when they stepped on the streets of Manhattan, and Lower East Side, and they cut their hair and they changed their clothes and shaved their beard off, and they tried to anglicize themselves as much as they could. Of course, they couldn't change the way they speak, like I can't, but they could at least change or anglicize their name to something that had a few more vowels in it.
Right,
So
right
that's
now. I'm sorry.
And we hear this every single time.
We do.
And thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, in my own family, before they ever got to Ellis Island, my father's cousin, Louis Jerushewitz, decided he wanted a much more American name. And when he got to the United States, he was going to use an American name, and he chose Captain. So, and then I have another, my mother's uncle Sholomovich came over, and he did the same thing. He wanted an American name. He changed it from Sholomovich to a name that meant the same, Friedenson. Yeah. It's funny, yeah. Next. Okay, so this is a one-page 1897 Chips manifest. It has a certain amount of information, and again, it depends where the person was coming from. As to all the manifests differ as to how much information they have, but accessing them is great. And the other thing that we highly recommend is don't just look at your particular ancestor's entry. Look above it. Look below it. That person may be traveling with someone you didn't realize they were, and it may be a relative.
Check to see if it's the same neck town they're coming from. When we do this kind of work and we help people, as well as the names of these people that come, I want to find great Uncle Harry, we're thinking in our heads, well, when, where, what are the dates? The reason why we mentioned with respect to passenger manifest in 1906 as a very important date is because the United States government decided, because of so much immigration, they needed to really have a better handle on it. And so that's why the pages after the July 1906 go from one page to 2 pages, which has many more questions. And also the naturalization process became much more formalized, so that instead of being able to naturalize in any court of the land, and there were many different courts for different reasons in the United States, it was formalized into the superior courts of states and the district courts of the federal government. And so we're always thinking in terms of the dates that we know when there are changeovers of information, when you get more. Because one of the things about doing genealogy is knowing your documents. What does this tell me? Why should I retrieve it? Will it help me? Because obtaining the documents is a bit like building a family tree in and of itself. Each document and the information it contains leads you to get the next piece of information. Okay.
I just want to mention that, as you may be aware, there were other ports of entry for immigrants. So we spoke about New York, there was Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, and there were Canadian ports. And coming from the Far East, and sometimes Russian immigrants took the Trans-Siberian Railroad across and came through Japan, San Francisco and Seattle as well. So after 1892 and until 1924, the Ellis Island database, accessed through Steve Morse's website, is where you can find a manifest. Before that, Ancestry has documented, and I believe FamilySearch.com also has some passenger manifests.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, naturalization records. These are sometimes less important than you think, sometimes more important. It depends what you get. When an immigrant first landed in the United States, he filed a declaration of intent, which did contain quite a bit of information. He next filed, after residing here for 5 years, a petition for naturalization, which also contained quite a bit of information. Okay, this one is a petition right here. He actually lists, and we've seen this quite a bit, the names of his children, their exact dates of birth, where they were born, where he was born, and where his wife was born, and sometimes their date of marriage. However, the actual naturalization certificate says nothing. He's basically forswearing his allegiance to his former place where he lived, like the Tsar of Russia or the King of Poland, and he's been granted his naturalization. So that particular document, although it's lovely to have it, as genealogists, it doesn't give us very much information.
No, but it will provide you maybe with the petition number.
Yes.
On the corner, the top corner, which you then use to do the research to get the declaration of intent and the petition, which gives us all this wonderful information.
Okay, census records. Benefits, you get a family group, you get siblings, you get birth years. The earlier the census is taken for your family, the more accurate the dates of birth are going to be. You may get a date of immigration, which may or may not be true. We've seen a great variation in dates of immigration from the same family. They sometimes have selective memories. 1900, sometimes 1910, will list just for the wife the number of children she's had total and the number of children who have survived. And so sometimes you may find out that your grandmother had more children than you realized and they didn't all make it. The other thing is, and this is important too, is if you're looking at an early census and you see there's a family group and they happen to have a lodger, and it says lodger or it says boarder, it could be the brother of the wife if the last name is different, if the last name is the same as the husband, the head of the family, it's probably his brother. And if there's an unmarried single woman, the chances are very good, especially if her last name is different than the head of the household, that she is the wife's sister. And this is a really important way to find siblings of the nuclear family that you're investigating. Okay, it will list profession. In the United States, the census that reveal information for us begin in 1850. Before that, all you really have is the head of household, number of children under 5, number of children under different ages, and the number of slaves, possibly, depending on the year. 1890, the census was destroyed in a fire and flood. There are no copies. There are fragments of copies that remain, but they're useless, and we suggest filling this in by looking at city directories. And as you know, the census for 1940 was open not that long ago. It does not contain a tremendous amount of information. What it does contain is telling us where they were in 1935, their profession, and their address. The address was dated immigration, and so there's a lot of details that are missing from that particular census, yes.
The only use it could be is if you had Jewish refugees who got out of Europe just prior to 1939, 1940. If they were living in Europe in 35, you'll get that. But
it'll tell you.
Genealogically speaking, we're getting less and less value as the demand of the census for the government and what its rationale changes over time.
Yes, you had a question.
I found that on census records, some on the list of offspring and such, those odd names sometimes are servants listed on there.
I'm sorry, say that again?
House servants.
It will say servant, but if it says boarder or lodger, then you need to think to yourself, especially if you look where the person is from and it's from the same country that your family is from, it could be a relative, it could be a sibling.
Good point, sir.
Yeah. I mean, maybe not, but it's important to...
No, I've seen that distinction.
Yeah. Okay, so this is Saul Levinson's family, 1870 census. We've got A. Levinson, that's Abraham. Here is his wife. Her name was Henrietta, yes. And here are all of their children.
Young Solomon
And
is
it
1
says
year
they were
old.
born, and this is the perfect example. They say they were born in Poland. Poland was no more. So they were from Posen. Okay.
And notice how where the children are born. Who's ever heard of a town called Cala?
California.
You know, there's one other census if you have California ancestors that is important to know about, and that's the 1852 California census. However, it's in miserable condition. Some pages are very clear, some pages are obscured, some pages have been ripped off. But once in a while, if you need to, you can make it hit. Okay. This is a military record. Is this a World War I?
Yep.
This is a World War I. This is for Saul Levinson's son Aubrey. And it tells us World War I documents can be very helpful. In this particular situation, Aubrey was a native-born Californian, and we know that, but it does give his exact date of birth, which is probably pretty reliable, and it tells us where he was working. It tells us whether he's married or single, and in this case, he's supporting his mother. For people who were born overseas, this is one of the documents where they sometimes happen to mention the town that they came from. It's a really great document to find. Okay, and they ranged from 17 to 18 depending on where you were. Yes?
That particular one, the World War I,
Yes.
sometimes, especially if they had come from Germany,
Yes.
they would not state that they came from Germany.
Okay, that's a very good point. People's nativity also swayed with the wind of political favorites. And sometimes people fudged their place of birth depending on what was going on politically in the United States. Absolutely.
It's also worth bearing in mind what the World War I draft registration is. It's not, the word draft should not be highlighted so much as thinking of it as a class registration. Who is here, who is present? The law that enacted this registration covered all men up to the age of, I think it was 46, by 1917 and 1918. So, even if you had an immigrant ancestor, male, born as early as 1874, I forget my math, and was not naturalized, but was in the United States in 1917, 1918, he would be registered as well as any US citizen. And so it becomes a really valuable document. I was working with a family in Birmingham, Alabama, and my client's father had 3 brothers, and they all said the name of the town, and the guy, thank God, wrote it down. Although 3 times it was spelled differently, I knew which town it was. And so, particularly as Victoria says, they are invaluable. Word of advice, Ancestry did a really bad job in some cases of digitizing them. And the Georgia National Archives actually has the originals, and I've actually sent away for the original, it cost me just $5 for a really nice photocopy. So if you look at Ancestry or any other site that happens to have this, and you don't think the copy is good enough, you can send off to Georgia National Archives, and they will send you a really nice copy for $5.
And this brings up another point. Some of the digitizations on Ancestry.com are different from digitizations of the same documents that you might find on Family Search. They might be clearer on Family Search, so it's important sometimes to check both websites if you're having trouble reading a particular document.
Have they gotten the front and back pages of those paired up properly again?
Of what?
Of these things?
Well, Ancestry does.
Ancestry, okay.
Yeah.
There's that.
But there's all these websites, once in a while you run into, they're missing a page. It happens.
Although what they had done was they'd taken the picture side by side of the front of one guy's and the back of the other guy.
These have been pretty good. I haven't run into
Yeah,
them.
well, anything, I mean, once you get away from an original and you're looking at anything that's digitized, then you always have to have that thought in your mind. What am I looking at? When you're looking at a modern transcribed English of a series of records, bear in mind that's what you're looking at, not something that was created when the contemporaneous with when the records were created in the 1800s. You're someone of modern times in making that index. They may not be as au fait with the language and write it all down correctly.
Well, actually, these were probably digitized from microfilm, is what I suspect. So.
Well, or from the originals, because we have the originals.
Yeah.
Jeremy, Victoria, we're running toward the end of a scheduled time. I'd like to have some time for questions.
We're just at the end.
Great.
Thank you, though.
Thank you, George.
Okay, so we just have a couple more items we want to mention. Social Security applications, you can apply for these through the Freedom of Information Act, and the benefit of this is that you will have the maiden name of the mother and the father's name as well. Next slide, please. Okay, passports. Once again, if you can obtain passports in the last 3 years or so, Ancestry has been putting online a tremendous number of passports. They have a lot of information. This is a very early passport. It has practically no information. However, for me, it showed me that where this fellow was in 1862.
Long time ago.
Next. Okay, and I think one of the last things is city directories. We use them constantly. There are many of them available online. They help you to create a true chronology for your family. Again, bear in mind that most of these directories were probably assembled the year before publication date. So just keep that in mind, but it helps you to figure out addresses. If you can't find somebody in a census and you can find their address, you can use Steve Morse's reverse census program, which allows you to plug in an address and find which enumeration district the census page may be on, and to be able to locate it. We've worked backwards many times for this too.
I just did that, but unfortunately I found out that the enumerator did actually miss out the street address. So even though I found them in the city directory and then used our friend, because Steve is a member of my society, his wonderful website to work backwards to the enumeration district and the page the census should be on, the enumerator actually skipped the house.
Right. Okay.
Actually, no.
Oh, okay.
You want to mention, we brought this page up not just because it is a city directory, but also because it has the Levinson family. After Abraham Levinson and 2 or 3 of the children died, his wife Yetta and the remaining children then moved down to San Francisco. And you'll see
There's Solomon.
the widow and Harrison Street, and at the bottom line you see Solomon Helper with the Blumenthal & Co. company, who are well-known fancy glove makers, ladies' gloves in San Francisco.
Now we're going to tell you why that's important in a
Believe it or
minute.
not, I think one of our relatives is on that slide.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's impossible.
This is just an example of a death notice, which I mentioned. I wanted you to be able to see it. This is Edward, Solomon's brother. This is also, I believe, listed in your handout. These are other documents that you should be considering as tools to find your family. And now we're going to give you a little surprise. This is Solomon Levinson, who we've been speaking about.
And here is a gentleman concerned. And I said 2 slides back that he was, in 1885, a helper at Blumenthal & Co., a fancy ladies' gloves manufacturing business. Around about 1900, a friend of his went up to him and said, "So, you make gloves, don't you?" He said, "Yeah, I make gloves." "Well, you know, I do boxing, but the gloves I got are really bad. Could you make me a pair of boxing gloves?" So Solomon Levinson looked at his boxing gloves. Now, as you know, gloves are flat. You put your hands in them flat. And old boxing gloves used to be flat too. You had to cramp your hands around the thickness of the glove in order to box. But this gave the boxers cramp in their hands and their fingers. So he designed a glove that curled, and he took a patent out. He went into business in 1905, and between 1905 and when he died in 25, no one stepped into Madison Square Gardens without wearing boxing gloves.
Made by Saul Levinson. So we have here original Saul Levinson gloves. They were last manufactured probably in the early 1920s.
They're 100 years old. I have a dozen pairs of his gloves. They're
They're cool. I know. They're great.
And as well as doing all the research that I do for my family, for my genealogy society, and for clients, I also work on people who I find
I'll come around that way.
interesting. Solomon Levinson, a San Francisco founder, who's world famous, hopefully, for making the world best boxing gloves in the 20s and 30s.
I know.
Okay, we've got a few minutes for some questions. I'd like to focus questions as opposed to comments. So if what you've got is a question, this is a good time for it.
What is the most efficient and practical way for a person to bypass all of this and have a professional do it for him, and what would it likely cost?
Well, one of the challenges we found is that people come to us and they say they want to do this. They have in their mind an idea, but having seen the talk that we've just given, we realize there's actually a lot more that can be done, but we have to focus what your desires might be so you don't drain your bank balance down to nothing. So there's stages in which the work can be done. I mean, any professional who, there are a list of people out there, members of the Association of Professional Genealogists, of which Victoria is one, who can take you on as a client. What do you want to have done? How far back do you want to go? Do you have a particular one family that you're interested in? I mean, straight away you have 4 families with your 4 grandparents, and who knows when you go back in time, where is this going to lead? You never know where the brick wall is going to be, the supposed brick wall. We talked about at the very beginning, always getting the siblings, because if you hit a straight line brick wall with your grandfather, you can't find anything, you might have to go through sideways to his brothers and sisters. So it's a really labour-intensive operation, I won't deny it. We spend hours and hours, and we give you far more hours than we should. But it can be a challenge, it's a lot of fun, but it depends on, we sit you down for an hour or two and say, well, what is it you want to know? And then we work through a program of this is what we'll look at, and we'll spend this much time working on it. We'll give you reports, family trees, that kind of thing. So you have a one-on-one consultation.
Taking it out of the hands of the professionals here for a second. I've used professional searchers twice. Okay, there's what I would call the $100 class, which is I have a highly specific question I need the answer to. You have access to that question, great experience. Give me a few hours and see if you can give me an answer. Then there's what I would describe as the couple of $1,000 problem, which is I've got a class of problem I need some work on, need some advice. Okay, is that give you a frame here? Okay. Harriet?
I have heard of a lab or a company where you can give them a swab inside your mouth and they can go back and tell you not your specific history, but your generalized where you came from and so forth. Could you talk about that and tell me how do you do it and what do you think of it?
Yeah, sure.
Can I interject for a minute? There is an article that goes into this in great detail on Steve Morse's site. And he's an MIT graduate. He invented a computer chip. He really knows his stuff. We have a different opinion about the actual value of this. Go ahead.
Well, yes, but there are basically 2 companies that one can go to. One's called Family Tree DNA, and the other one's called 23andMe. One of the challenges with these companies is that the pool of people is still very, very small. Family Tree DNA pool is about 500,000 people, and 23andMe is about 120,000 people. So when you consider, if you're Jewish, the percentage of people in there is going to be even smaller. The chances of you finding a hit or relating to someone, which is what people do it for, is going to be very small. You generally follow the traditional path of genealogy, and as I said at the beginning, the first thing you do now these days is collaboration. You may be collaborating with someone and have a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing really specific. You get a lot of names that match, places that match, but then you can do something like.
Let me just interject.
Yeah.
I think what you were asking specifically had more to do with finding kind of where you came from. The problem is they go back very far and it's very vague. So we don't see a tremendous amount of value in it at this time. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to say let's terminate that branch of discussion because that can take up another hour. I will simply say that what they mentioned a minute ago, the most powerful version of that is if you've got somebody who you think you've traced back 4 generations and they've traced back 4 generations, you're staring at the same person and you're not sure.
Right.
You both get a test. The test will tell you for sure, with the exception of what women loosely call a paternity event that's unrecorded. Okay, but for sure whether your ancestors are correct. They can never tell you that.
I'll talk loud. I'll talk loud. So, when your relatives are from Eastern Europe,
Right.
and so say you can find out what town they're from,
Yeah.
from Ellis Island perhaps,
Yeah.
and then like what do you do then?
Well, if you want to keep moving backwards, people have been, for the last 20 years or so, methodically trying to index and digitize and access records from overseas. And so much contrary to people's opinion or knowledge that, well, there's nothing overseas, right? I can't find anything out. It's not true at all.
It is there.
There's plenty out there right now, and there's more coming online every day.
And it would be like in English, these websites?
Oh, yeah,
they are?
yeah, these websites are in English, sometimes birth and vital records may be in a foreign language. You can still order them and you can have them translated.
If you go to Jewish Gen and look under databases, you'll see many databases that have been created by the special interest groups who
Which are all
have particular
throughout
interest for
Europe.
that geographical region, Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine. For example, the biggest one is what we call JRI Poland, Jewish Records Index in Poland. They have about 4 million records.
And what these groups do is they make agreements with the governments and with the departments of vital records to access these records. And sometimes those agreements shift, like Romania. It's kind of in a tenuous situation right now, but they are actively pursuing that. Yeah.
And
something
One
else
of
on
the
there.
other
just one
reasons-
short quick, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, one of the other reasons for the special interest groups, everybody understands SIG, which you'll see in here, means a special interest group. So, for example, you might have a special interest group in Romania, and those would be people who will speak Romanian, understand Romanian. Okay. So one of the things you can use the group for is if you've got a document that you think may be relevant, you can ask somebody to help translate.
And if I may, can I just ask one quick question? Are there any, I should know this maybe, but are there any records of concentration camps other than like that big thing? I know there's one in
You mean Yad
Israel.
Vashem?
Yeah,
Well, Yad Vashem is the first place to start.
yeah.
But also ITS, the International
Tracing.
Service, has now got an agreement with the 8 or 9 countries that are responsible for those records. And the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
is the repository. And they just actually started putting a database on, a searchable database online, reading about it yesterday. So
It's
go
like
to the
just-
U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, check their website out. They're now actually changing the way the records are being viewed. Instead of individuals going to ITS, they're now putting everything online, recognizing that historians and genealogists need to access this information.
And then there's another one, Bet Hatfusot. And they are a repository of genealogical records, and they have records of people who were in the Holocaust as well.
Okay, one last question, and our guest will be available afterwards. Betty?
Can you tell me where Posen, what country Posen was in 1880?
It would have been Prussia.
Prussia, which Germany?
No. Prussia was the Prussian Empire. It owned perhaps some territory that later became Germany, but Germany were unaligned states in 1870. They became Germany. Prussia was the Prussian Empire.
Because my great grandparents listed their country
As
Posen, Germany.
because see, it gets really tricky. They spoke German in Prussia. They thought of themselves as Germanic. It was the Prussian Empire, and Posen is what had been Poland.
So it
wasn't Germany.
You won't see a picture.
They would have liked you to think that, but it wasn't.
Okay, I want to thank our